Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korea's 21st presidential election officially begins in less than a day, with more than 14,000 polling stations set to open nationwide. Voters will cast their ballots from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m., after which sealed ballot boxes will be transported under police escort to 254 counting centers. Over 70,000 election workers will begin tallying by 8:30 p.m. using both machine and manual verification to ensure accuracy. Now, this snap election, triggered by an unexpected vacancy, follows a strong early voting turnout of 37.4%, the second highest on record. Yet the final results may hinge on voter participation in key regions such as Yeongnam, the capital area, and Chungcheong, where early vote out lagged behind. With polling blacked out since May 28th and candidates making a final push across battleground regions, the race enters its final stretch marked by uncertainty and urgency. So tonight, we take a closer look at where things stand and where they might be headed. For a deeper discussion on this, we are joined here in the studio by Susie Kim, Professor of Political Theory at Kyunghee University. Welcome, Professor Kim.
Hello, it's great to meet you, Mok-yeon.
And also joining us online is Lee-hyun, Dean and Professor of Law at Handong International Law School. Good to see you again, Professor.
Always a pleasure to be on the program.
So let's start right away. Professor Kim, let's start with the tone of the campaign itself. So during the 3-week campaigning period, it looks like candidates have mostly focused on negative campaigning and also issue-driven tactics. Why do you think this was the reason, and what kind of impact do you think it has on the overall election?
So certainly the past 3 presidential debates were filled with political mudslinging rather than a substantive focus on policy issues and domestic reforms, as well as constitutional reforms. I think part of the reason why there was comparatively less focus on public policy was in part because all the candidates, I think to a certain extent, are hiding their true motivations out of fear that they will lose votes. After all, any specific policy proposal is bound to generate winners and losers, which means that those who expect to lose from a given policy will be discouraged from voting for a candidate who supports that policy. So, I mean, basically every candidate is aware of this, and so they have a personal interest in being as vague as possible about, specific policy proposals and the projected expected outcome of those policies. So I think that it actually makes sense that these candidates are being deliberately vague about their policies. And moreover, I think the negative campaigning and personal attacks that we have seen throughout the presidential debates will probably have some effect on the voting results, but I'm not sure whether this will be any sort of substantive effect insofar as it's, these issues that were raised in the public debates were already to a large extent known to the public through the mass media and other portals. So I doubt whether this kind of mudslinging will have any substantive effect.
Mm-hmm. Right, but it's, thank you for pointing out that, the reason why many of them have been remaining vague about their policies, because they had to be cautious about people who are going to vote depending on their policies. Now, zooming in on the candidates' final moves, over the final weekend before the election, each candidate made last-minute efforts to win over voters, and Democratic Party's Lee Jae-myung campaigned in the capital region and Chungcheong, and PPP's Kim Moon-soo in Gangwon and Gyeongbuk, and Lee Jun-seok of the Reform Party focused efforts in the capital region as well. Professor Lee, what do you think is the significance of these campaigning locations? Were these regions strategically chosen to consolidate votes at the last minute?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, you have to think that in terms of the strategies that each of the campaigns are putting forward, the strategists themselves and the candidates must have, of course, studied the demographics and the trends that are going on, as well as the historical patterns, voting patterns of the electorate. So when it comes to Lee Jae-myung, excuse me, I mean, he focused on the Seoul metropolitan area as well as Chungcheong province. And basically, of course, Seoul, being the largest number of votes in terms of the electorate, is often been seen as sort of a swing region swinging between progressives and conservatives depending on the election year. And so obviously because of the large number of votes that are in the Seoul region, capital region, the focus there is going to be obvious. He wants to be able to consolidate those votes that he has, but also potentially attract swing voters who may not have made up their minds in terms of deciding between basically the two candidates here. And then in terms of Chungcheong province too, I mean, this has always been seen as not one area that can be seen as being for the progressives or for the conservatives. So there is, a potential battleground province that he's focused on. Now, for Kim Mun-soo, for the PPP, I mean, his focus was Gangwon-do and also the Gyeongsang region, where I am right now. And those have traditionally been seen as more conservative. Gangwon province less so, potentially, but again, many conservative votes there. And so I think what he was trying to do is to make sure that the base comes out to vote for him, particularly because of Lee Jun-suk, who's also a conservative, is a third-party candidate, and there, Kim Mun-soo needs to make sure that the votes that he can count on, that those votes will come out for him, as well as potentially others who can make sure to get out the vote for him in terms of the election. And then lastly, for Lee Jun-suk, his focus was mostly in the capital region, and I think the interpretation there is he knows he's not going to win, but I think what he's trying to do is lay the groundwork for the next presidential election, as well as if in fact Lee Jae-myung does win, the aftermath is for the Conservative Party, I think, a realignment, and I think he wants to be part of the conversation and be part of the leadership potentially for a new conservative movement. So I think there you see the strategy being laid out by all of the candidates here.
So definitely, it seems as though there are a lot of strategic thinking behind those final stops by the candidates. Now, let's also turn to the early voting, which took place May 28th and 29th. The Democratic Party, Professor Kim, has historically been encouraging voting, believing that progressive voters tend to show higher participation in that. But interestingly, this time, the PPP also been encouraging, voters to participate in the early voting. How do you read into this? Why the shift?
So in past elections, I mean, keeping in mind that most progressive voters tend to be within the younger 2030 generation, I think in past elections, the vast majority of the younger 2030 generation has supported the Democratic Party for the most part. And I think, and because a vast majority of the 2030 generation vote during the early voting period because of their work schedules, I think it makes sense that the Democratic Party would really sort of encourage its voters to support vote during the early voting period. But the thing is that things have changed a lot in recent years. So the Conservative Party has actually managed to increase its support base among the 2030 generation, which is why they're, I think, encouraging early voting these days. And we can think about some of the possible reasons as to why the Conservative Party has managed to increase its support base among the 2030 generation. One sort of possible reason, and this is speculation, but I think one possible reason has to do with the younger 2030 generation's disillusionment with the policy upshot of the Democratic Party. So just to cite one example, I think many of the 2030 generation sort of expected President Moon, who was elected in the 19th presidential election, to decrease housing prices in Seoul and elsewhere. But as we all know, those policies didn't really have such an impact. And so I think a lot of this sort of disillusionment with the actual policy upshot of the Democratic Party has dampened some of the 2030 generation's support for the Democratic Party. And so that might explain this kind of shift towards the Conservative Party among the younger generation.
So a potential shift in which party that they want actually could have, yes, so their approach has definitely seemed to compare to previous elections as well. Now, building on this early voting, now this presidential election saw an early voting turnout of 34.74%. Although it's slightly lower than the past presidential election, it's still the second highest on record. Professor Lee, what voter psychology do you think this reflects?
Well, I think clearly it goes to the point about the gravity of this election. And, obviously this is a sort of reaction, I think, to the political turmoil because of the martial law fiasco. And of course, the impeachment of the president. And so I think a lot of people have a vested interest, I mean, beyond just the normal interest in a presidential election. This is a real turning point in terms of the country, in terms of responding to what happened in the recent past. So I think this is a direct response to the crisis that was in Korea in terms of political circles. And we haven't had a president, we have an acting president for a while. And so now the people will speak in terms of now selecting the president. And I think this marks potentially a potential sea change when it comes to thinking about politics in Korea because of what happened. But also, I think in terms of the early voting, as Professor Kim was noting, I mean, in terms of the younger generation, I think, and also this is maybe, I think, a symbol of sort of where things are heading, is, with respect to early voting, I think the idea is that, it's very convenient, not necessarily, but it also, I think, shifts maybe potentially to, getting out the base when it comes to each of these candidates. And it's, you can interpret it, of course, very differently depending if you're on, Kim Moon-soo's side or if you're Lee Jae-myung's side. They have different interpretation and spin in terms of what the high voter turnout looks like in terms of the situation. But in terms of this circumstance, I think what you can see here is that this is a big reaction, I think, in terms of what's been happening in Korea generally. And I think, again, a response to the crisis that was in Korea and the political turmoil. So I think now Koreans are able to express themselves, I think, fully in this national election in terms of the actual aftermath of martial law.
So this high early voting rate leads us to a eventually bigger question. So Professor Kim, I have to ask, do early voting results typically affect the main election day voting or the overall race outcome? And could you also tell us about the pattern in previous elections?
Yes. So I think at this point, for this specific election, early voting results do not necessarily indicate anything about the final voting result, I think. And I think, it really ain't over till it's over. I mean, it's a slogan that has been repeated over and over again. But, just to repeat what I've said earlier, in previous elections, higher early voting turnout used to indicate a more favorable outcome for the Democratic Party. But in part because younger voters in the 2030 generation have increasingly moved towards the conservative side, higher early voting turnout doesn't necessarily indicate that the Democratic Party has an upper hand. And so I think it's really too early to tell, based just on the results of the early voting turnout, who has the upper hand. And so, we can't really tell who has an advantage or disadvantage based on the early voting turnout, I think.
Right, especially because we're seeing mixed patterns in the past races as well. But trust, of course, in the process remain a big concern. Issues like, poor management at polling stations during early voting have once again raised concerns about the Election Commission's credibility. Professor Lee, what kind of impact do you think this could have on Election Day?
I think it could have a really bad impact on the election because, as you noted here, the big issue is public trust and credibility. And so the most significant aspect, if there's irregularities that are going to be sort of found out about the election, basically the whole integrity of the process is going to potentially be called into question. And there's always been, underlying, at least on the fringes of Korean society, but also heading more towards the mainstream as to basically, these irregularities may indicate, potentially election fraud. And so that was a claim that was, of course, made by President Yoon because of the, his whole justification in part for martial law was voting irregularities. And so this just plays into that narrative that because these irregularities are present, that basically, you cannot really have a free and fair election in Korea because the system is rigged. That's the narrative story. So the Election Commission, I think, has to be aware of that and has to really put on a clean, basically corruption-free election in order to certify the results so that the whole Korean population can be confident in the actual results. But beyond credibility and sort of the questions about irregularities, then the question, of course, becomes, is this going to demoralize the voter base because, people, can't trust the process? Now, I don't think that's going to happen here because there's such a vested interest in terms of this particular election. But like going forward, if you have more of these kinds of situations, then that could potentially suppress turnout. But I think, in the long run, I think what you're going to see is, this polarized climate that we're in, we're going to have continuing accusations of voter fraud. And, you see this being played out around the world, where in the United States or in other countries, when you lose an election, the accusation is going to be made that there's voter fraud and you can't trust the election. So I think the Election Commission really has to be very careful and attentive to this problem, because this is not just for this election, but elections going forward. And I think they need to do a better job in terms of making sure that this process is full of integrity.
Right. So even though this is expected to go on for, who knows, but there should be efforts to regain trust from the people again. Now, then, Professor Lee, polling data blacked out since May 28th. We're aware of that. Most recent surveys showed a narrowing gap between Lee Jae-myung and Kim Moon-soo from the big rival parties. What last-minute variables do you think could still shift the political landscape?
I mean, as we've been talking about, I mean, the early voting, it's too early to tell, obviously, who that favors. But clearly, early voting as versus the election turnout as a whole, of course, is going to determine the election. And in terms of last minute things, I think that obviously is that dynamic, which we won't know, of course, until tomorrow, what the percentages were in terms of the voting. But in any event, I think that's obviously one of the last minute kind of details that I think the candidates themselves will be very interested in learning. But also, just last minute issues that come up. I mean, we had Yu Shimin, talking about, he's one of the progressive camp, talking about, Kim Moon-soo's wife, or you have, this Ibak, school, the parent, some accusation of manipulating, comments. And, these things come out sort of at the last minute to sort of sway those voters who are kind of on the fence, because, I mean, you certainly have the base and those people who have already decided, long before this election, who are they going to vote for. But I think that what's happening here is, these last minute kinds of issues that, come to the fore are really for those voters who haven't really made up their minds. And I think that's where the key is in terms of this election is, how many swing voters are there, and these issues, are they going to sway either one side or the other? And at this point, we haven't necessarily seen any surprises in terms of last minute things that have happened, like an announced merger, for instance, which is not going to happen. But on the conservative side, but the fact that we haven't seen these kinds of talk with respect to these kinds of day before the election, I think is indicative that the candidates themselves have played out all the issues that can be played out, and right now really it's a question of sort of where we are in terms of the people who are undecided. I think that's going to really decide what the election is in terms of the actual outcome.
Right, so swing voters, where their votes would head would be key. Now, finally, before we end our discussion tonight, Professor Kim, so when an election is held, especially on this very shortened timeline like this one, what kind of potential issues or concerns could arise from the standpoint of, electoral quality or procedural democracy?
Yes, so just to lay out on the table what the core ideals or functions of procedural democracy might be, I would argue that the core ideal or function of procedural democracy is to find politically legitimate, or in other words, publicly justifiable solutions to questions about our shared social life. The thing is that in modern conditions of deep disagreement, we don't have such a shared standard for deciding what is a good outcome or what is a bad outcome. So that means that it's virtually impossible to agree on a substantive outcome without unfairly excluding certain views or privileging certain others' views. And this is where the importance of procedural democracy comes in. And procedural democracy is important because, according to theories of procedural democracy, the assessment of legitimacy or public justifiability of a given policy depends on whether that decision was reached through the right procedure of public deliberation among citizens. Now, the thing is that, again, just to reemphasize, in modern conditions where there is deep disagreement about what counts as a good solution to political questions, it makes sense to define political legitimacy or justifiability in terms of whether a political outcome or decision was produced through a fair procedure where every citizen is included. Now, because the lead up to this presidential election left us only 60 days to assess the presidential candidates and their policy proposals, one could certainly argue that the legitimacy or public justifiability of this election's outcome has been undermined somewhat. And this is, again, because citizens had no sufficient time to form a reasoned opinion about each of the candidates and their policy proposals. And so that means they had no sufficient time to deliberate about the policy proposals or to exchange views with one another about, which candidate is the best person to lead the regime going forward. Having said this, however, I think political legitimacy or election quality really depends at its root on whether Korean society offers a free and sort of all-inclusive public forum for political debate, where everyone has the chance to speak their mind and to criticize each other in a free manner. Now, all of this is to say that if we truly care about political legitimacy and producing good quality elections and so forth, then what really matters is focusing on building a robust public forum where everyone can where everyone's political views are equally heard and reflected in decision making. So I just want to emphasize that point going forward.
All right. Thank you for your opinion. I'm afraid we'll have to wrap up our discussion at this point. We're running out of time. But thank you so much for your insights tonight, Professor Kim.
Thank you.
And Professor Lee, of course, we appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.